It's hard to find a version of the Middle Ages in popular culture where the knights aren't rusty brutes, the peasants aren't covered in mud, and the landscape isn't ravaged by war. Just turn on Netflix or HBO. Life in the Middle Ages just seems harder. Plagues swept the world. Dramatic climate change led to food shortages. Unstable political power created unpredictable violence. Religious prejudice and superstitions were common, and no one had invented a single iPhone. From the Devil's Historians, How Modern Extremists Abuse the Medieval Past, by Amy S Kaufman and Paul B Sturtevant. Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we interview subject matter experts and content creators to learn why this figure continues to endure and consider what we can learn by examining what historian Maurice Keene called the matter of the Greenwood. During this episode of Into the Greenwood, I'll be interviewing Amy S Kaufman, who is one of the aforementioned subject matter experts, and, as the author of a new Robin Hood novel, is a relevant content creator as well. A topic that Dr. Kaufman specialized in was that of medievalisms, a subject that we've covered before, including on the recent episode with Dr. Lucy Barnhouse. One fascinating way in which Dr. Kaufman has studied the use of medievalisms is in how evoking the Middle Ages is often used as a form of propaganda, sometimes in seemingly contradictory ways. A group of people that one might want to demonize could be referred to as being absolutely medieval or straight from the Dark Ages, in order to promote a notion that these people are especially unenlightened, barbaric, or violent. While at the same time, images of the Middle Ages can often be used to convey a sense of strength and supposed nobility. One need look no further than modern American politics, when the president posted on social media, "Long live the king," after ordering New York City to end its congestion pricing, and the White House following suit with a photo of the president wearing a crown. Examples of this sort of behavior are usually not as blatant as that, but once you start looking for them, they show up all over the place. To quote another line from Dr. Kaufman's work, medieval history is too often wielded by the powerful to justify their opposition to positive changes in the world, or to feed their prejudices about people they deem inferior. Fortunately, our perception of the Middle Ages and how we interface with that time period through the creation of medievalisms doesn't just get perverted to unsettling ends. It can also be used as a source of inspiration, such as the notion of Robin Hood-style acts of joyful rebellion, as I discussed with Dr. Barnhouse in episode 54. Or to help inspire new creative works, such as Dr. Kaufman's new novel, The Traitor of Sherwood Forest. In addition to discussing her novel with me, Dr. Kaufman also touched on some of her areas of research, the notion of whether or not there's still some value in the term neo-medievalism, and how, unexpectedly, to modern audiences at least, awesome the character of Nimue is in Le Morte d'Arthur. So, string your bow, consider what your favorite pieces of historical or fantasy fiction convey about the past, and join me in the Greenwood, with medieval scholar and novelist Amy S. Kaufman.
Hi.
Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for
Nice to meet
joining me.
you too.
Welcome to the Greenwood. I don't know how much you had a chance to look at the podcast and see what we do here.
Yeah, I've listened to a couple episodes.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually as I was writing and sort of promoting the book, it was nice to have this Robin Hood companion. So someone else thinking about Robin Hood, someone who thinks about Robin Hood more than I do.
Yeah, I have to admit, I do end up thinking about him quite a lot. More than I expected to, even as somebody who grew up liking and enjoying Robin Hood.
Yeah.
This really has become quite a thing. Yeah, I'm glad that you've had a chance to listen to some episodes. We're really engaged with trying to explore sort of every facet of the character we can, and a topic that's come up a lot recently has been medievalisms. And our my last guest was Dr. Lucy Barnhouse. In fact, and we talked
I
a
listened to that one. That was fascinating.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And we had Minsu King on before, who's also studies
Mhm.
medievalism. So it's very timely to have you on now as well, but also because you have a book coming out.
I do.
So would you like to sort of introduce yourself to the podcast audience and then tell us a little bit about your new book?
Sure. I'm Amy S. Kaufman. I'm a former professor of medieval literature, and I used to write about, believe it or not Robin Hood, but Arthurian legend and then medievalism in popular culture.
Hmm.
And I taught a lot of courses on medieval myths and legends. That was kind of my favorite topic. So that got me into reading the Robin Hood ballads and thinking about the huge distinction between those early medieval texts and what we see on modern film, and it kind of wouldn't go away. It stayed in my brain. I kept thinking about it, and eventually I turned to writing fiction, and I've written a novel called The Traitor of Sherwood Forest, which is based on the medieval ballads, and
Hmm.
which pulls scenes from the medieval ballads and tries to flesh them out. And that is coming out April 29th, which is 2 weeks from today.
Yes. Are you familiar with the Adventures of Robin Hood book written by Roger Langston Green? It came out in the 50s. He was one of the Inklings, so a pal with
Oh, right. Yeah.
and one of his big projects was writing this Robin Hood book where he tried to blend together all the earlier sources, the ballads, but also like the plays by Anthony Munday and the
Mm.
later ballads that Child and Ritson had collected, and tried to like blend them all together. And this project was brought to mind because your book does something very similar, but only in relation to those medieval ballads. It takes Robin Hood and the Monk and the Jest of Robin Hood and Robin Hood and the Potter and Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne and tries to weave all of those ballads together into one narrative.
That would be it would be fascinating to try to weave all those together with Monday and some of the later sources, because there's so much contradiction.
Right. Yeah,
I'll
you
have to
get a
look at that.
and honestly, I don't think it works super well. I think the parts of Lansland Green's book that shine the strongest are the ones that he's just cribbing entirely from other writers earlier. But that's neither here nor there. Your work, The Traitor of Sherwood Forest, is a Robin Hood book, but Robin Hood is not the main character. You are going for a much different perspective for your book. Who is the main character in your?
The main character is Jane Crow, and I really wanted to tell the story from a peasant woman's point of view for a couple of reasons. One is that she's the very kind of person that Robin Hood is supposed to be helping and protecting. And the other is that we don't often hear their stories in medieval historical fiction. Usually, when you have a female protagonist in medieval historical fiction, she's a queen or, a noblewoman or a kind of like breaks the
Mhm.
mold, exceptional woman, swashbuckling, sword fighting. She participates in the action, but she uses her mind, right? She's more of an observer, and that makes her a great lens for the modern reader who comes to Robin Hood with a whole lot of preconceptions, right? And a whole lot of stories, and then slowly those are peeled away through her as a lens. I say all that as if I had this grand agenda when I started writing, but it was really a little more woo woo than that, like a little creative. Jane came into my head. I kept thinking about these ballads. I kept thinking about Robin Hood's character, and it all just sort of started to come together. It wasn't until later that I realized what I was doing. My scholar brain separated out while I was writing.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate having that, wanting to have that perspective of somebody who is a local peasant getting caught up into this world. It's the perspective that I feel gets lost the most in Robin Hood adaptations. And this is something I've felt strongly about for a very long time. When I was in college, I was with a um, medieval fair reenactment group, and we were doing a Robin Hood year, and I helped write and direct that one year, and I insisted that we have like, okay, we got Robin Hood and the Merry Men. They're on one side, and there's the sheriff and Guy Gisborne and their men, and they're on the other side. And we did like the living chessboard battle scenes that you see sometimes in Renaissance fairs. So it's very set up to have two sides. But I was like, we need to have a third side. That's the peasants. These are
Right.
the people who live in this area that are being impacted by the sheriff and being impacted by Robin, like making those characters be somebody who had voice and who were around and not invisible and not just Merry Men
Yes.
and Sheriff, Robin and Sheriff, like Robin, Sheriff, and the Baker. It was all super, super important to me. And
And the
so,
Potter, right? And I mean,
yeah.
I tried to weave them into the book so that they're not just victims or observers, but they're part of his network, which made sense to me. Given the way that he's set up, is that and you often see nameless, anonymous people showing up in the ballads and doing things, and then disappearing. One of them is in Robin Hood and the Potter, and it's the girl who carries the pots. uh, when
Mm-hmm.
when Robin worms his way into the sheriff's house by selling pots in the market, there's a girl who carries the pots for Robin to the sheriff's house. So I gave Jane that role.
And it was also a nice excuse, utilizing those ballads to bring in the sheriff's wife as a character. Joy seeing her because she's right there in Robin Hood and the Potter, one of the earliest ballads we have. And
Mhm.
then almost every adaptation, especially the Hollywood ones, drop that concept that the sheriff's has a wife. Usually it's so he can pursue Maid Marian or something, and they set up
Exactly.
a love
Yes.
triangle or
Yeah.
whatever. But I like, it feels more real and fleshed out for him to have a wife, and I don't know, having a couple more female characters around doesn't hurt either.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how the introduction of Maid Marian to the legend, which comes later, really changes the whole story into a love triangle, right? Like suddenly, the sheriff wants her, or Guy of
Or
Gisborne
Prince
wants
John
her,
in the case of
or
the Monday
John.
plays, even.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Like everybody wants Marian. Whereas Robin Hood in the medieval ballads is devoted to the Virgin Mary,
Hmm.
which could not stand in Protestant England, but it makes for a very different kind of story if he's not fighting for the heart of a woman.
Right. Yeah, there's no romantic love interest in
Mhm.
those medieval stories. It's much more about the devotion to Mary and the bromance with the
Yes.
other outlaws.
Yes. Yeah, the friendships are so important, and the loyalty is so important, and in that sense, my main character Jane becomes sort of an interloper. Like she causes trouble among the merry men, although it's trouble that would have come naturally.
Yeah. So, since we've launched into discussing this book, and you said that you got to thinking about it through the courses you were teaching and this character of Jane entered your head, what kind of solidified the notion that like you were going to do it, that you were going to really sit down and write a Robin Hood novel? And how did
Well,
your training and career as a medieval historian inform it?
I started it for myself. So when you go into writing fiction, your first book doesn't always get picked up.
Hmm.
And so I had an agent right about the start of the pandemic, and we were shopping around a historical fantasy I had written. And I floated this idea by her. I think I had written, I don't know, maybe 10 pages of the Robin Hood story, and said, would anybody be into this? This Robin Hood who is not like the man we think he is. And she said, yeah, absolutely. So I wrote it during the pandemic and sent it, and it sold right away. So I didn't really have time to think about
Wow, wow,
the
congratulations.
thank you, the repercussions of what have I done to Robin Hood, who will get mad at me. And I really just got to immerse myself in this world at a time when the world was really quiet around me, because of
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic. I'm alone in the house, I'm not seeing anybody. So I just dove into medieval England. I dove into the ballads. I immersed myself, and I'll say I immersed myself in primary sources, primary texts, much more than scholarship, which tends to be, as someone who has written it, tends to be interpretive, right? I wanted to feel and see and taste the setting. And yeah, so it was just kind of a deep dive for me.
Yeah.
And the book popped out.
So I've started reading some of your papers and your nonfiction works, and I was really quite enjoying your book. I guess it would have come out shortly before you started working on this, The Devil's Historians.
Yes.
The devil, let's see, I think the full title is The Devil's Historians: How Modern Extremists Abuse the Medieval Past.
Yes.
And that's a book that is very much distressingly timely.
Yeah, I mean, distressingly timely, but also, it was a 2020 book and it's already out of date. Like you could write a whole
Yeah.
second book based on examples.
I also read your paper, Medieval Masculinity, and
Oh,
in
yeah.
that you cite things from Trump and his first term, and in the beginning of his second term, he refers to himself as a king, and the White House tweets a photo of him wearing a crown.
I know. I know. It's almost too depressing to think about. I think it's part of the reason that I haven't really worked on that stuff since, because it almost felt like Cassandra, like screaming into the void, please someone see this. And it's just playing out. It's getting worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. We didn't talk, I don't think we talked about Robin Hood at all, other than dropping an occasional reference in that book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it gets mentioned a couple of times, but mostly in passing.
Yeah, there is some
Especially when you're talking about medievalism, it's almost impossible not to talk about Robin Hood because there have been so many Robin Hood movies. It does so much to
yes.
color our perception of the medieval ages.
Yes, and there's great work. There are great scholars who work on this. Sabina Rahman, Valerie Johnson, Alex Kaufman, no relation. They've all done really great work on how medievalism and Robin Hood sort of shifts depending on the period that
Yeah.
you're in, and how it's used.
Hmm.
But I would say if we're connecting my work on medievalism back to the fiction writing, I think it made me very conscious of the beliefs that to medieval historical fiction, and it made me more attentive to fleshing out certain things like the role of women, or what
Hmm.
masculinity looks like, or just certain day-to-day things like who is responsible for economic production in society. What is a medieval person's faith like? That was a really
Right.
important thing to me in the book. We think of the medieval church as kind of oppressive hammer that restricts what everybody could think or say or do, but there's actually like huge fluctuations in medieval faith. So my I didn't really go into the book with an anti-medievalism agenda. I guess I made a medievalism, and now I
You
can.
did. I didn't want to say, but
No, no, no. I know. Putting it out there now. Now people can tear apart my medievalism, but yeah. But I will say, I mean, I came to medieval studies out of a love of the literature, and I had always wanted to write fiction. So the scholarship is a part of that,
Mhm.
but this writing this sort of feels like coming home to what I had always wanted to do. I'm not one of those people who wants to like go live in the Middle Ages. I don't do a lot of Ren fairs, but I love thinking about that time because it's an era in which so much of what we think about ourselves and what we know about our human history begins, right? And it's a
Mhm.
locus for so many of those things. So it's a
Yeah.
fascinating time to explore and think about.
Yeah, and it just, and this is so much where the medievalism comes in. It so much gets used as a touchstone for how we're going to relate to ourselves now, whether it is, Ivanhoe being used by being latched onto Confederates in the States, whether it's isolationist movements in the early 20th century, whether it's, the post-Vietnam war-stricken Robin and Robin and Marion. It is,
Mm-hmm.
or the current war in Afghanistan that you see in the 2018 Robin Hood movie being not, I wouldn't even say put a medieval filter on, more of a thin veneer. Um,
Yeah.
and it's so much a, oh, we're going to take this and then just use it to talk about what is happening now. It's sort of the historical period for reflecting current problems the way that science fiction as a whole is the lens for dissecting current problems.
Yes. And I think it's because we think of the Middle Ages as our kind of origin story, even though it's not. And that's also, we're only talking Western Europe when we
Yeah,
talk
and then
that
I was going to
way.
say, like,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
being
We
Western
as being
Europe,
like
white
Hollywood.
Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
American filmmakers think of the European Middle Ages as the kind of cultural infancy. And when they look back, they think they are seeing humanity's natural state. They think, oh, well, if it was in the Middle Ages, that's how we are really meant to be. And that's where a lot of these fascist arguments come from. It's like, oh, we look back
Mhm.
at what we imagine the Middle Ages to be, and that must be natural. Men's roles, women's roles, religious separation, racial separation. They imagine a past and then they call it
Yeah.
natural. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think that connects to why we see the quote unquote Middle Ages treated as the default when it comes to fantasy literature.
Yes.
Obviously, Tolkien was a huge influence on that just because his works were so seminal, and that's basically what he did. But, I love Lord of the Rings and I enjoy Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role playing games. I like all that stuff. But it has always struck me as a little weird, a little off putting that the default is a version of Western medieval Europe.
Yes. I mean, I will say with Tolkien, like he was a medievalist, right? So that's sort of where he came from, and
Oh, yeah.
a lot of our fantasy started as being, Lord of the Rings like,
Yeah, yeah.
spin-offs
He's
of Lord of the Rings. But yeah,
inspired by European mythology.
yeah.
It studies Old English. That is the world he was immersed in as a
But I
subject.
will say in fantasy publishing now, they're doing so much better. There's so much African mythology and Middle Eastern stories and Asian literature. Like they're doing a lot better at
Hmm.
broadening fantasy. I think what happens though is sometimes in fantasy circles they stay with the same three or four authors like George R. R. Martin, Patrick Rothfuss.
Yeah, those are the ones that are treated as
They
safe bets by Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly. Like You might throw in a woman if you're lucky, but she's a white woman, So, but there's just like a rich body of fantasy out there now. There's so much to explore. But I
Yes.
think for a while, I even remember feeling it because I've been a fantasy fan my whole life. I think it was, maybe the mid 2000s. I was like, am I done with fantasy? Because I can't find anything. But then like N.K. Jemisin exploded on the
Then you
scene,
get
and
this, yeah.
Eddie Okorafor, and like, yeah, you get this incredible body.
Hmm. Yeah, and I this is something I've been really excited about myself. I've not had a chance to delve into a lot of that fiction yet. I'm looking forward to it. But the thing that excites me, not only just that it exists, but also now that it's available and that it's what my kids are growing up with.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, these are books that they are finding in their school libraries. These are books that they are growing up with and reading, things that were absolutely not available for us when we were impressionable youths getting
Yes.
into fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, it was hard to find any women worth mentioning in fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
You'd find a little bit, but that
Hmm.
that really didn't start to pick up until like 90s, early 2000s. So fantasy is in some ways has been a conservative genre and is slow to broaden, but I think it's broadening now, which is really nice.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's one of the ways in which it's been a little slower than science fiction.
Yes.
It's cooler sibling.
Yeah, I know. Definitely, yes.
Yeah, and we can just thank Roddenberry for wokeness entering sci-fi relatively early, I think.
Woke, oh God. I do keep wondering if people are going to think this is a woke Robin Hood because I don't even really know what that word is supposed to mean, but
Oh,
I
it
don't know.
it
There's a
means
girl in it,
whatever
so
you want it to mean.
yeah, there's a girl in it, so probably,
Yeah, it's yeah, the main character's a girl. Of course it's woke.
of course.
Yeah. Your version of Tuck is a Muslim. He
Yes,
that's woke.
that's woke. You're probably that's such a great. I mean, that's one of the things that
He's
you know
got to
that
be
that
an anachronistic friar.
yes, the Kevin Costner movie. I mean, it is one of the things that it sort of made part of the canon that I think is really interesting. That movie does tie Robin Hood to the Crusades in a way that I don't.
Hmm. Yeah.
To make it part of the story, but yeah.
Right. Well, and that's you were really reliant on the medieval ballads as your primary sources,
Mhm.
and there's zero mention of anything relating to the Crusades in those medieval Robin Hood sources that are extant. We
Right.
can't know for certain if there were other medieval Robin Hood sources, but the ones we have, the ones we know, there's absolutely nothing that relates to the Crusades in them.
Yeah, and I'm going with the two chronicle mentions and the two Scottish chronicles, which put him in Edward the First's reign in the late 1200s. Andrew of Winton and Walter Bauer.
Just to check myself, there might be something that Sir Richard of the Lee says about going overseas, but
Yeah, I think you might be right, but
nothing that relates to Robin Hood himself as
yeah,
a character, and
yeah.
him as a character does not have any connections to the
No, he does not
being
have a
a
connection.
crusader in any way.
And I have a conversation, I think I do have a conversation about the Crusades because, of course, Edward was on crusade and failed spectacularly. But Robin himself, the ties that I found tied him to the Second Barons' War, and so that's what I used.
Hmm.
Not to say that that's the most authentic version, but that's just
Right,
what we have. Yeah.
right, and a lot of it is speculative. I've
Yes.
read historians who have gone to bat for Edward the First as
Mhm.
being the Edward that is mentioned in the ballots, the King Edward. I've seen Edward the Second used quite a lot. That's,
Yes.
I think, a very popular Edward for that purpose. And I've even heard cases for Edward the Third, although it's a little less common. So I think there are cases that could be made for any of those as being the Edward that is referenced.
Absolutely. Because chronicles are not to be trusted. That's the thing. Like
Right.
we see them as history writing, but they're interpretive. They can be fantastical. They always have an agenda. Not that modern history doesn't sometimes do that, but but yeah, so I think some people look at Chronicle and think, well, this is,
Right. It
the
is.
historical record, but that concept of scientific history does not really exist until later. So
And the
so
written,
whatever they
yes.
say can sometimes just be a parable for the time that they're writing about.
And the written versions of the ballads that we have that reference an Edward were written down in the 1400s, well after any of the Edwards' reigns.
Yes, which is a decent case for Edward III, because medieval people often set their stories sort of in their own time, the way that we sometimes do,
Right. The
like
closest Edward.
like yeah, like the World War II Shakespeare plays, like
Yeah.
they often did that. But I still chose Edward the just because I linked all those dates together, and it made sense with the story of the Robin that I wanted to tell.
Yeah. So would you mentioned that the Barons' War there that you linked that to? Would you just tell us a little bit about what the Barons' War was and why you found that link with Robin Hood?
Sure. Well, I found the link because I think it was Bowers' Chronicle in 1440 said that Robert Hood, which was, Robin Hood, fought with the forces of Simon de Montfort, who was
Hmm.
the leader of the Second Barons' War. It was a rebellion against Henry III. It's often glamorized in English history as this sort of power to the people rebellion, but actually, like, the barons didn't want to pay their taxes. And if you are a medieval king, then very often you filter your tax collection through the Jewish community, which
Right.
also happened at this period. So there were pogroms against Jews as part of the Barons' War, which was something I hadn't known until I delved into
Hmm.
this history. It all sort of started coming together for me when I started reading about it. So de Montfort rebels against Henry III, and at first, Edward I, who is Henry's son, is on the side of the barons, but he turns against them and then fights with his father, and then the barons are eventually defeated. So I imagine Robin Hood as a young soldier in this war who sees the man who becomes his king, Edward, turn against his people. And it's sort of a formative moment for him, but I won't spoil too much of the book.
So I have a confession, and it's getting you to talk about the Second Barons' War was really an excuse to bring up what is probably my favorite line from your book, The Devil's Historian,
Oh,
when you wrote, and I had this snippet here, a medieval king's power was often limited, and managing a kingdom could be an exercise in herding ambitious, heavily armed cats.
thanks. I honestly can't remember if that's Paul's line or mine, so I'm splitting the credit
All
50-50.
right.
It's true. Like, I think we look at someone like Henry VIII and his grabs at absolute power, and we think a medieval king has that kind of power, but he doesn't. He's got
Hmm.
constantly warring people beneath him. He's, half the time an English king is at war with France, the other half the time, like, he is France.
Right.
Like, there's so much going on to split his monopoly on power. It's not
You
really centralized until later.
Yeah, you get a figure like King John, who we so much characterize as being a tyrant, a tyrannical king, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this reputation comes from him having all of these wars with these
Yes.
various barons and with the people in his holdings in Ireland and wherever else. So he's always having to put down rebellions. He's always fighting with his barons. And if he was a tyrant in the how we kind of think of it nowadays as somebody who has a form of absolute power, they can rule tyrannically with this iron fist, he wouldn't have had as many problems as he had. But he
Mm-hmm.
didn't have that degree of power, which is how and why the barons were able to force him to put his seal on Magna Carta.
Yes. Yes, and Edward, I mean, arguably, if we look at him through a modern lens, is much more tyrannical in all the things he does. He
Hammer of
makes
the
war his
Scots.
yes. he makes war on his neighbors, he persecutes the Scots, he persecutes the Jews,
The
throws them out
Welsh.
of England.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Welsh, like he's I'm not going to draw any modern parallels, but he's like eyeing up all his neighbors and thinking about all the people he can deport, and he's not a great guy.
Yeah, that legacy building through expansion of
Mhm.
territory. Yep, yep.
Yeah.
No modern parallels there.
Have you seen the trailers? I don't know if there's a proper trailer yet, but the ads for the Death of Robin Hood movie that's coming out.
I've seen a like an interview with the film's writer and with Hugh Jackman and some reporter for an entertainment outlet that included a lot of like snippets from other movies.
Oh,
Um, but I haven't seen anything that was like properly like a trailer or a teaser for this
I've
movie.
just seen a picture of like Hugh Jackman's like painted up face. So
Oh, I've missed this somehow.
yeah, I'll send it. I'm
I
not sure how this movie's going to go, but it does seem to indicate to me that people are maybe interested in a darker Robin Hood story.
That's
Um,
everything I've heard. It indicates that
yeah,
they are going for a very dark Robin Hood, leaning heavy into a grim and gritty,
yes.
trying to struggle with the weight of the world Robin Hood.
But they also, the description says that he's solitary, he's
Yeah,
alone, which
I
is
thought that was an
so,
interesting choice,
yeah,
given that
it's so
he
antithetical.
famously isn't.
Yeah, famously. And like delving into the Merry Men's characters was one of my favorite parts of
Yeah,
writing this. I
yeah,
felt for each of them in turn. I just they had such they were so interesting if you just looked at their actions and the things that they said. Nobody's really got a big backstory, but it was fun to explore those.
right, right. Yeah, let's get a little bit into the Merry Men. Just the other day, I suddenly had this revelation, this kind of fear that I was like, where does the term merry men come from? Where's actually the first time that gets
Oh
used? I
gosh,
couldn't call it to
I
mind.
don't know.
It's in Robin Hood and the Monk. It's
Oh
right
my
there at the very
gosh.
beginning. Yeah, so I just pulled up. Well, let me start at the very beginning as far as sources that we have, and just start searching through them. Oh, it's right there at the beginning
It's
when
right there.
Robin says decides to go off to St. Mary's and he's going to bring somebody with him. And he's like, oh, of all my merry men, Little John is the one I want with me, or I want to hold my bow, or whatever the line is. So it's like, oh, okay. Whew. All right. It is
That's
right there
not a
from the
very
beginning.
merry story.
It is not, but the term is there
Oh, that's
from
so
the
funny.
get-go. It is not some anachronistic thing that got slapped on later. We have this
Yeah.
concept of the merry men right away. We have a group of outlaws right away. This that an original story, or not original, but that early story that we have, as you said, is not a very merry story, but it is a lot about loyalty.
Yes.
Little John and Robin have a fight in it, but then it's all about Little John trying to save him. It's about, and then at the end, Robin Hood is even like, "You should be the leader of the band," and Little John's like, "No, I can't do that. You're the boss." But it's still about them having this band, considering who's the leader, being loyal to one another. Much the Miller's son is in it with him too. Will Scathlock, like a lot of these characters that have existed to the modern day are there.
Mhm.
You're right. Like why they're there, who they are, we have no idea. We don't really know with Robin either. But gosh darn it, they're there.
They're there. And even in the Chronicles, John is always with Robin.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
Chroniclers really seem to want to build an identity for Little John too.
yeah. I think he's criminally underrated in modern film. Like he's a very strong character in the ballads, and he's
Hmm.
brave, he's heroic, he's loyal. He's
Yeah,
not the Sam to Frodo. He's more than that.
right. And you get a reciprocal loyalty with them
Yes.
also. In Robin and Guy of Gisborne, Little John is getting saved. So like there are early ballads where Little John is saving Robin Hood and where Robin Hood is saving Little John. And they have a great, bit of banter back and forth and beautiful camaraderie in Robin Hood and the Potter. It's
Yeah.
and it's there. Little John's a big part of the jest of Robin Hood. Yeah, he's there. I agree, often criminally underused. He's like the one that you feel like has to be there, And so writers put him in because they feel he has to be there in like a lot of the modern movies and even some of the TV shows. But then they don't have an idea what to do with him. They just have him
Yeah,
be
they
there
don't know,
because
and they make him stupid half the time, which is I play with the stereotype, in the book where he appears to be like this big jolly guy, and he's deeper than that. But yeah, and it's almost like he becomes a foil for Robin in modern stories where Robin is smart and clever and capable because he's got this little John following him around.
right. Yeah,
So,
he's got his muscle, there behind
right,
that.
exactly. Robin is the brains, but it's absolutely not like that. Robin makes dumb mistakes in the early stories.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the Merry Men, for as much as they are well known, and it is incredibly impressive that these supporting characters are household names 800 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is a phenomenal thing, and I think it is a very underutilized aspect. There's so much interesting character development that can be done with them, and there are a few writers who are playing with that. We have a book club and this kind of Robin Hood Discord, and we read Robin Hood books, and we read Park Godwin's Sherwood book, and
Yeah.
the Little John in that one is a very fascinating character. That book is set immediately post the Norman conquest, so much earlier than your book. But that is a Little John who kind of can't let go of the past, can't let go
Mhm.
of having been a conquered people, and it really affects him. And so we then wanted to read a more Little John centric book, and we found one from the 1950s called The Good Yeoman, and it's
Oh, interesting.
yeah, by Jay Williams, and it's kind of a novelization of the Jest of Robin Hood, but all from Little John's perspective, or primarily. And that was an interesting read, but one of the very very few books I found where Little John is forwarded as the main
I've
character.
got to read that one.
Yeah, I think you'd like it.
That
There's
sounds
two different
fascinating.
editions of it, which we found out
Yeah.
at our book club meeting, which was hilarious because there was an earlier American edition and a later British edition, and major event changes happen. We
Ooh.
mentioned like, oh, Will Scarlet getting spoilers for this book from the 1950s, beheaded, and it's such a tragic but poignant death scene. And one of the other people in the book club was like, "Was it a poignant death scene? Like they just kind of found him." And it's like, no, no, no. Here's the description of his death, and they're like, "Oh no, that description of the beheading is in my book, but it's the sheriff who gets beheaded."
Oh,
And
whoa.
those with us
Wait.
with the British version were like, the sheriff dies. In our version, the sheriff doesn't die. You're like,
So it's
really?
the American version where oh, that's wow, you
They
could write a whole
He
book
did
on that.
major revisions in
That's
these editions.
fascinating.
And
Oh, that's
there
really
was nothing in
cool.
like a foreword that made it clear that there were these
Oh my gosh.
revisions or anything.
Wow.
And finding out in the moment in the book club was absolutely hysterical.
Oh my gosh, my mind's spinning. Why did they do that?
And some of it was interesting things. Some of it was kind of fascinating changes in terms of, not at any point I would never call it a feminist work, but making it less misogynistic. Like in the first version, Little John has a girl from his home village who you never meet, but he thinks about her sometimes, mostly in terms of a little bit disdainful about like how dumb she was and how she had bad breath.
Oh,
And
jeez.
in the revised version, she gets a little bit of page time. And when Little John is later thinking back on her, there's zero mention of her having bad breath or rotten teeth.
Wow. Oh, I just would love to get into the head of whoever edited it and made
Yeah.
those changes. That's really interesting. It does feel like American Robin Hood stories are even more fixated on the love interest aspect of the story.
Hmm.
That's a sweeping generalization, and actually, you probably know more than I do, but it seems to me, and even the new one that's coming out, where Robin is alone, the Hugh Jackman one, it does seem like Jodie Comer's character is going to be like a love interest redeemer kind of character.
Yeah, it's they've got it set up that even if she's not a love interest, she's, the woman that heals the warrior's wounds and
Yeah.
helps him find himself. It's very much ooh, this is kind of stereotypical, gotta
Yeah, it
put the
feels a
woman as the
little,
healer of the male
yeah,
warrior kind of role, which I'm
feels
not.
like it
We'll see how
could
they
be
handle
tricky.
it, but on the surface, I'm not excited.
Yeah, same. Especially given, well, I don't want to spoil the book. Never mind. We'll just skip that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
but Marian's not in your book.
No, Marian's not in my book.
But again, you are mostly relying on the original medieval sources, and there is no Marian in those medieval
Yeah.
sources.
Mary is in my book. I mean, not personified, but she's important
Right.
to the
There's
book.
a shrine to her that Robin has. He
Yeah.
venerates her, similar to what you see in those ballads.
But
Yeah,
Marion
Mary.
often goes hand in hand with Robin's gentrification, right? Where he
Right.
becomes an earl, and so then his marital status and his romantic status matters more. So since that is not an aspect of the book, it was
Hmm.
important to me that he doesn't like hook up with a noblewoman. I mean, not permanently.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm the sheriff's wife.
yeah, yeah. I loved
Uh,
writing that storyline too because it's implied in Robin Hood and the Potter,
oh,
right?
it
Like,
really is. It's kind of
yeah, yeah,
fascinating, a little bit of subtext there in
yes.
Robin Hood and the Potter. It's subtext. There's nothing explicit in there,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have to read hard between those lines.
No, no, and that's part of the trick, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a author who also was previously a professor of medieval literature, J. Rudd.
Hmm.
And he's got a series of Robin Hood novels which have a very explicit, very ongoing relationship between the sheriff's wife and Robin Hood. She is
Oh,
easily the
interesting.
best character in those novels. Yeah, she is, yeah, an active ally, but interestingly given a degree of agency in ways that feel both modern, like coming from our perspective as modern readers, but also appropriate for a woman of her time period. There's at one point
Mhm.
she kind of is given an option that would let her annul her marriage to the sheriff. She's in this loveless marriage, but she decides to stay married to him because she's like, well, I appreciate having this position that I have. I have a level of security, and I'm still stepping out on him anyway whenever I want.
Well, medieval marriage is much more pragmatic.
Yeah. And yeah,
Uh,
and she takes a
yeah.
pragmatic look at it, which
Hmm.
was the part that didn't feel like how we normally think of her.
That the whole marriage for love thing. I mean, it's there is some of it in medieval legend and in medieval romance, and but in ordinary everyday life, it's a later concept.
Yeah. Yeah. This was something I talked about a lot with Sharon Bennett Connolly when she was on the podcast,
Mm,
just in terms of, maybe the marriages weren't for love as we think of them, but they certainly were for companionship and compatibility, because you want your home life to be happy, you want your
right.
alliances to work out. You're not likely to try, even if a woman has relatively little say in who their father tries to hook them up with, the father isn't going to want to hook their daughter up with somebody who's going to abuse her.
Yeah.
This is not me trying to shill for arranged marriages by any stretch, but it's just to say, just because the marriages were arranged doesn't mean that they were miserable affairs. Even though they
Right.
weren't for love, doesn't mean that people couldn't still find joy and happiness and companionship with the people that they were set up with.
And sometimes people who marry for love can be miserable.
What?
Occasionally.
It's been known to happen, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to talk about your book, The Traitor of Sherwood Forest. Before we let you go, I did want to hit on one other topic relating to medievalism, just because
Mm.
I came across it in one of your papers. And in the paper, I think it was the Medievalism Unmoored. It looked like an older paper.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
it was kind of about the contentious nature of the term neo-medievalism.
Hmm.
And this is a term I have come across before, but I don't feel like I have a good grasp on it. And since medievalism has come up a lot as a topic on the podcast, but we've not really discussed the notion of neo-medievalism, I was wondering if I could lean on your expertise a little bit to help explain to me and the podcast audience what neo-medievalism is.
Yes. So that paper, so I will say that I feel like we had a moment when I was writing that paper where there was a distinction between medievalism and neo-medievalism. And for me, the way I defined it, although it was in a journal with a lot of different definitions of medievalism, the way
Mm-hmm.
that I defined it was medievalism through a lens of medievalism. so so it would be like a medievalism, a depiction and interpretation of the Middle Ages based on a work of medievalism. So,
Okay.
a great example is all the fantasy based on Tolkien, right?
Yeah.
Tolkien is writing medievalism, and people who are inspired by Tolkien are writing neo-medievalism because it's
Mm-hmm.
it's through an additional filter. They're not looking back at the original and making an interpretation. They're making an interpretation of an interpretation. So that was a distinction I made, and a lot of us were making in the scholarship, although I think it's sort of fallen out of academic fashion and people are just using medievalism more broadly. Part of
Mm-hmm.
the reason for that is that most medievalism nowadays is what I would have defined as neo-medievalism. Most of it is not looking at original things. Most of it is looking at things that have looked at original things. The
Yeah. Yeah.
Robin Hood medievalism that we have today is usually interpreted through something in the 19th century, or the Disney movie, or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah,
So
something I've talked about a lot in the film review episodes is how like, oh, after this certain point, like all of these things are being done as a reaction to the Errol Flynn movie.
yes, yes,
Every depiction of the Sheriff of Nottingham after Prince of Thieves is a reaction to Alan Rickman's performance. So it is
yes.
these things informing one another in this long, interesting chain, but it is this clear chain where they are looking back over their shoulder at the thing that is in most recently in the rear view.
Yes, exactly. Right. And even a lot of our modern medievalism, video games, fantasy novels, television, is based on 19th century medievalism, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
acted as its own filter. It chose to make medieval heroes uncomplicated, and I'm trying to think of a word that's clean. uh, Not very sexualized, like sort of innocent, and
Oh, yes, yes.
and
The gallant
and
shining knight and
right,
the
and
fair
more
virginal maiden. Yes.
gender dimorphism, right? Like women. And anyway, so a lot of what people confidently say about what the Middle Ages were like and how they want to make it, George R. R. Martin is a great example. He said that for his research for his book, he read a lot of historical fiction, right? So that's a work of
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
neo-medievalism, right? He's reading people writing the Middle Ages as fiction. So
Mm-hmm. Right.
anyway, that's a distinction
Okay.
that I need. I'm not sure if you if you still need to know it. I mean, I like that paper. It is old, but I'm not sure that that term is still used to make a distinction between medievalism and neo-medievalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is a certain level where the granularity gets hard to fine tune
Yeah.
because everything is informing everything else. Every new version of Robin Hood is not your grandfather's Robin Hood, which just yeah, like every new medieval thing is just by its nature not an original work created by somebody who has never seen any of our
Yes.
other media based on the Middle Ages. They've only ever read historical sources and now they're creating a new
I mean, not even mine. There's a fox on the cover.
Yeah, that's true. And you mentioned his fox-colored hair
Fox-colored hair. Yeah, I mean, I
right from the
really do
beginning and it's
have,
like,
like, yeah.
yeah, wonder what that's a
I have
reference to.
I have little Easter eggs, right? Like it's all part of our consciousness. I have lots of little things woven in there from other Robin Hood stories.
Hmm. Yeah, so absolutely. And that's natural. And that's part of the the chain that we are in.
Yeah. And
Part
the
of history, part
mythology,
of
right?
creation. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. It's always evolving.
what I like about that is that that is also what medieval writers did. They created
Mhm.
these almost like Marvel universes of characters like King Arthur or Sigurd or Robin Hood, and they pulled from different sources, and they
Mhm.
did something knowing that their audiences would recognize all the little things that they included.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I did also want to ask, because you just mentioned King Arthur again. You mentioned that was kind of what especially brought you into medieval studies. I only managed to read the abstract. It was behind a wall, but you had a paper about Nimue. What a fascinating character she is in Le Morte d'Arthur in terms of defying expectations, not necessarily of what an audience member of the time would expect, but what we would expect an audience member of the time to expect.
Yeah. Yeah, you see that a lot. And actually, I can send you that article, but I think it's on my academia page as a PDF.
Yeah, this was just
If
what
anybody wants
came
to
up
access it.
from my Google
Yeah.
Scholar search
Yeah, but it's
from
that
JSTOR
was
or
actually
something.
from my dissertation.
Oh, okay.
It was one of the first articles I ever published. And yeah, the theory is, and a friend of mine who passed away a few years ago, she actually, her final book was on this subject, that we bring these conceptions about medieval women to Arthurian legend as readers, even though we're scholars, even though we're supposed to like make a separation between our medievalism and what we see on the page, we bring these conceptions of medieval women's limited roles and medieval misogyny to the page, and then we don't see what's actually happening on the page, where like a character like Nimue is rescuing Arthur and casting magic and choosing
Hmm.
her own husband and all that stuff.
Yeah,
It's almost like
rejecting
the
Merlin.
brain, yeah, burying Merlin, in a tomb. It's almost like the brain doesn't see it. Like
Yeah,
it can't
burying Merlin
register.
in a tomb, but then still being an ally to Arthur.
Yes,
That's kind
yeah.
of mind-blowing.
It's mind blowing, but Merlin in the Mort is a very shady character. Mallory doesn't trust him at all. And he's also the son of a devil and a nun. So
Right.
yeah, so Mallory gets rid of him super early. He's like, this guy Merlin, he's a hot mess. Like
Way sooner than most people
we're
would
gonna
think.
bury him.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Merlin gets redeemed, I think, later in literature, but yeah, it's really interesting.
so my question to you though is, knowing that you have this interest in the Nimue character and the medieval Arthurian legends, and that you are now a published author with the Traitor of Sherwood Forest, are you going to write a book about Nimue or somebody
I
else
have
or some other character
So
in
I do
the
have
Traitor
like
of Camelot?
I have a draft, a little partial draft of an Arthurian story, but there's so much good Arthurian fiction coming out right now that I feel like I'm gonna let it sit. Like I feel really close to the material. Have you read Lev Grossman's The Bright Sword?
I've had that recommended to me.
Okay,
I've been wanting to pick that up. Yeah.
it's a really fresh take because it takes place after Arthur's death. Uh,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
it's very good. So I kind of feel like what I want to do with the Arthurian story, I might do someday, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's as fresh a perspective as
I
I'd
have
like to bring to whatever I'm doing. Like, can I
yeah.
separate myself from the fact that, my dissertation had a chapter on feminist retellings of Arthurian legend? Like, the
Mhm.
weight of all those words is kind of on me.
I did just see in a bookshop window last year a new novel called My Name is Morgan.
Yes,
Um,
there are two new Morgan Le Fay series out. There's Lev Grossman's, and then there's I'm forgetting his last name. Jess. The Winter Night is another one.
hmm.
There's Tracy Dion's Legendborn, which takes place like in the modern world. So there's just so much Arthurian literature out there already. There's a lot to compete with.
I've had people ask me if I'm going to start up an Arthurian podcast when
Oh,
I'm done with the
interesting.
Robin Hood podcast, but there's 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 still a lot of Robin Hood material I haven't covered.
Yeah. They're interesting figures too, because I have seen scholars say that, in some ways Robin Hood's court is a parallel to Arthur's in the inverse, like the values are different, and Robin Hood's court kind of shows up the corruption of Arthur's court. It's like this inversion. But I also think you could say that about any royal court when it comes to the medieval Robin Hood. I mean, in many ways, the loyalty that Robin gets from his men, which is earned through not through money, but through friendship and reciprocal acts, is the opposite of what he sees when he goes to court in the Jest, for instance.
Yeah. I think it's easy to look for parallels where it's like, oh, we have a leader figure and a group of people around him. Let's see how we can compare it to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Like, I think just people gravitate to trying to make those connections, but they often feel a little forced, in my opinion.
Yeah. Maybe that's an act of medievalism too, is thinking that two medieval people have to reflect each other. But what I am working on instead of the over psychologically burdening Arthurian novel is a novel about Eleanor of Aquitaine, which is another side view character looking in on Eleanor, and then a modern novel that kind of satirizes dark academia. So we'll see which one goes through.
Satirizing dark academia. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, well,
probably not a topic for the podcast, but we'll see what happens.
Google dark academia for anybody interested in finding out more about that. Well, good luck to you on whichever or both of those projects move forward. Would you like to tell the listeners when the Traitor of Sherwood Forest comes out and how they'll be able to find it?
Yes, the Traitor of Sherwood Forest comes out April 29th. You can find it anywhere. You can buy it through Penguin. You can buy it at your local independent bookstore. You can buy it on the big digital bookstores. It's in ebook. It's in trade paperback, and my audiobook narrator is absolutely brilliant, and that will come out on the same day. That's Grace Gray. I really wanted, because it takes place in Mansfield, I really wanted someone who could do a Knots accent. And she's just incredible. I can't wait for everyone to hear the audiobook. So any form you want to get it, it will be available on April 29th, anywhere you want.
The people of the Midlands will appreciate that. I cannot tell you how many people I've met from Nottingham who care so deeply about how Robin Hood sounds.
Yeah, well, we went into it looking at narrators, and I was like, we cannot have a posh London accent. I mean, that is just not this story.
So. Well, just really upset him and give him a Yorkshire accent.
Or do a Kevin Costner.
Right.
give him an American accent. Anyway, so yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Yes, this was a great conversation. I appreciate it so much. And best of luck to you with the launch of the book and all your future projects.
Thank you so much.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
My thanks again to Amy S Kaufman for joining me in the Greenwood. During our discussion, Dr. Kaufman made mention of Bower's Chronicle as being her influence for having her Robin having participated in the Second Barons' War. Walter Bower was a 15th century Scottish historian, although this is a historian more in the vein of Herodotus than a modern serious academic. His chronicle on the history of Scotland from the 1440s, which is delightfully known as, and I swear I'm not making this up, the Scotch Ronicon, includes a reference to, and I quote, the famous murderer Robert Hood, as well as Little John, together with their accomplices from among the disinherited, whom the foolish populace are so inordinately fond of celebrating, both in tragedies and comedies, and about whom they are delighted to hear the jesters and minstrels sing above all other ballads. That mention of the disinherited is a reference to these outlaws having been on the losing side of the rebellion, led by Simon de Montfort from 1264 to 1267, the aforementioned Second Barons' War. Walter Bower was not the only quote-unquote historian to have ascribed substantive dates and a semblance of reality to the legendary outlaw. Before Bower's Scotchronicon was Andrew of Winton's 1420 work, The Original Chronicle of Scotland, which places Robin Hood and Little John as having been active in Barnesdale and Inglewood in the 1280s. And it's worth noting that while neither of these chroniclers provide any evidence for there having been an actual Robin Hood linked to the late 13th century, these accounts do predate the earliest copies of any Robin Hood stories that we have. This is why I checked myself at one point during the interview when I mentioned an original Robin Hood story. We don't know exactly what tragedies and comedies the foolish populace were so inordinately fond of. The stories we have were all written later, and there easily could have been many from that time that were simply never written down. Now is also a good time to mention that it was another Scottish chronicler, John Major, whose work from 1521 is where we have derived the notion that Robin Hood was active during the reign of King Richard I in the late 12th century. That's a notion that was picked up by Elizabethan playwright Anthony Munday, the supposed creator of historical fiction, Sir Walter Scott, around 1820, the Hollywood blockbusters starring Douglas Fairbanks, Errol Flynn, Kevin Costner, and a certain animated fox. The same fox that Amy S Kaufman gives a cheeky nod to in her novel. The chain of medievalisms that inform our perceptions of the past is a long one. But we can still study and learn as much about the actual past as we can, and use that knowledge to help recognize when the devil's historians are attempting to manipulate us by evoking a mythologized past that never was. I will, of course, include in the show description links to some of Amy S Kaufman's work and her website, where you can learn more about the Traitor of Sherwood Forest. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to help support the continued existence of this podcast, then please consider heading over to buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood, where it's extremely simple to donate one-time tips that show your appreciation for all the time that goes into putting these episodes together. And of course, what really makes this possible at all is our supporters on patreon.com/intogreenwood. Those recurring donations, even at the $1 and $4 level, are what lets us do the bare minimum of paying for our hosting fees so these episodes can be out there for you to listen to. Plus, there's also some extremely fun bonus audio on the Patreon for everyone who is at the Merry Bandit or Notorious Outlaw level. Of course, we'd be doing our guy Robin a disservice if we didn't donate a portion of all proceeds to a charitable cause. Our select charity remains Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated organization bringing sustainable food and clean water to impoverished communities around the world. If you've got a little extra cash and want to toss it at them directly, then by all means. As always, there is a link to their website in the episode description as well. If you don't have any extra cash, then you can still be immensely helpful to the podcast by leaving a 5-star rating, writing a little review, or simply sharing the podcast with your pals. As a small, independent podcast, every single rating, review, or share has a truly appreciable impact. Into the Greenwood can be found on Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. If you're inclined to just give social media a pass entirely, then you can just reach out over email with the address intogreenwood@gmail.com. Additionally, there is an active Discord server for all things Robin Hood related, run by friend of the show Mike Nichols. There we will organize watch parties and play games. It's also where we run the book club that you heard me mention in the episode, where we discovered the wildly different editions of the book The Good Yeoman by J. Williams. If you'd like an invitation, just reach out over email or social media. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing you all safe travels until our next journey together into the Greenwood.